The recording begins mid-sentence. That is the first thing the recovery team noted in their filed report, 3 weeks after the Ironfast's black box was pulled from the debris field at the mouth of the Kareth transit corridor. The box was undamaged. The Ironfast was not. The recording begins mid-sentence because I had already been talking for 11 seconds before I remembered to activate the log, a habit of mine that my executive officer, Commander Detch-Rahl, had logged as a formal complaint exactly once in our 4 years together. I had told him that if anything I said in the first 11 seconds of a crisis was worth preserving for posterity, we had larger problems. He did not find that funny. He found very few things funny. I found that quality in him to be indispensable. So, the recording begins mid-sentence, and what follows is my attempt to give the recovery team, and whoever comes after them, whoever reads this in whatever capacity these words are eventually read, a complete account of the 41 hours between the moment the Quorum Undying's wall crossed the Kareth threshold and the moment the convoy RCG-7 cleared the corridor's far terminus. The 11 seconds before the log activated are not lost. I remember them. They were me telling Rahl to get everyone strapped in, that the Quorum had crossed the threshold 12 minutes ahead of the projected window, and that I needed a firing solution on the lead compression hulls before they finished their approach spread. He told me a firing solution against the Quorum Undying was a philosophical statement, not a tactical one. He was correct. I told him to make it anyway. I am recording this account because the Ironfast's bridge recorder, which captures everything said and done on the command deck, survived intact and will eventually be transcribed. I want there to be a companion document, something in plain language, written by the person who made the decisions, explaining not just what happened but why. The transcripts will show the orders. They will not show the weight of them. I want the weight of them in the record. My name is Captain Inez Varro. I have commanded the RNV Ironfast for 6 years. I was given command of her at 43, and I regarded that as one of the 2 or 3 genuinely fortunate things that had happened to me in my professional life. She is a heavy escort dreadnought, Talcane class, laid down 11 years before I was born and recommissioned twice since. Her hull is not clean. Her hull will never be clean. She has the kind of scarring that accumulates on a ship that has been used, truly used, the way the Navy intended, not displayed, not preserved, not maintained in some orbital berth as a tribute to past deployments. She has been in 11 engagements across my tenure alone, and she carries the evidence of all of them in the plating along her port quarter, in the replacement panels on her forward weapons deck that are a slightly different shade than the original alloy, in the way her number 3 drive cluster runs 4% hotter than the others, because the intake was rebuilt from salvage after Perith Station. I loved her the way you love something that has never once let you down. She was not a beautiful ship by any conventional measure. She was not fast. She was not elegant. Her profile, when you approached her from the forward quarter, was blunt and purposeful and gave away nothing about her actual capacity. She looked, to an untrained eye, like an aging escort-class vessel of modest armament, the kind of ship that receives assignments based on availability rather than suitability. That impression had served her well. It had served us well. The gap between what the Ironfast appeared to be and what she actually was had been a tactical asset in every engagement I could name, and it remained an asset in this one, though the Quorum Undying was not the kind of adversary that maintains illusions about what it is facing. The Quorum does not maintain anything. It simply advances. I am going to explain the Quorum Undying, because I do not think the civilian authorities or even the Naval Review Board fully understand what we encountered, and I believe that understanding is necessary for everything that follows to make sense. The Quorum Undying is not a fleet. I want to be precise about this because the terminology matters. The word fleet implies a collection of discrete vessels operating under coordinated tactical command, ships that can be individually targeted, individually destroyed, individually redirected. The Quorum Undying is not that. It is a distributed consciousness of immense age. Our best estimates, drawn from the 3 prior contact events and the xenographic analysis performed after the Undrath encounter 14 years ago, place its origin somewhere between 300,000 and 420,000 years before the current date. It is older than our species' written language by a factor of roughly 40. It predates stellar cartography as a discipline entirely. The Quorum does not have a homeworld that we have identified. It has, as best we understand, always been in motion. Its physical expression, what we call its hulls, are not ships in any meaningful sense. They are bodies. They are the material substrate through which a single ancient mind moves through space. Each hull is between 40 and 90 kilometers in its primary dimension. They are not uniform in shape. They are not uniform in material composition. They are, as our science teams have described them, more analogous to cells in a biological organism than to vessels in a fleet. They do not communicate with each other via any signal we have been able to detect. They simply move. They move together. They have never, in 3 prior contact events, deviated from their chosen course. The Quorum does not attack. I need to make this clear as well. It does not fire weapons. It does not maneuver to engage. It simply moves, and what is in its path is compressed structurally, physically compressed, by the mass effect of 14,000 hulls in close formation moving through space at transit speed. Anything inside the Quorum's approach corridor that does not move out of the way is destroyed not by any deliberate action but by proximity, by the simple fact of its passage. The first contact event, at Seld Prime 2 centuries ago, was interpreted by the civilization there as an invasion. They deployed their entire naval force, by their records, something in excess of 900 vessels, in a blocking formation at the Quorum's approach vector. The contact event lasted 31 hours. No records survived from the blocking formation. The Quorum continued on its original heading, and has not passed through that region of space since. The xenographic team that catalogued Seld Prime's remaining records described the Quorum's passage through the blocking formation as, and I am quoting from the analysis, geometrically indistinguishable from the passage of a glacier through loose aggregate. The Kareth Transit Corridor is 11 light-minutes long and approximately 40,000 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. It is the only viable transit route through the Kareth anomaly for vessels of civilian mass class. There is no alternate route. The Quorum Undying's wall, when it crossed the corridor threshold, was 43,000 kilometers wide. There were 340 civilian vessels in convoy RCG-7. Combined mass, they required a minimum of 39 hours to traverse the corridor at maximum safe transit speed. The Quorum's closing rate, given the wall's mass and momentum, meant that it would reach the corridor's entry mouth, and everything in the corridor, in approximately 50 hours from the moment it crossed the threshold. 50 hours to cross the threshold, 39 hours for the convoy to clear. The math on its face suggested margin, 11 hours of apparent buffer. The math was wrong, and I had known it was wrong for 6 hours before the Quorum crossed the threshold. The Quorum's approach was not uniform. The wall's center was accelerating. Not dramatically. This is not something the automated tracking arrays flagged, because the acceleration was within the noise margin of their standard variance tolerance. But I had been watching the plots personally for 18 hours before the crossing, and I had asked our navigation officer, Lieutenant Priya Sen, to run a separate manual computation. She brought it to me without being prompted, because she had run her own numbers and arrived at the same place. The wall's center was going to reach the corridor mouth in 37 hours, not 50. The convoy needed 39. A deficit of 2 hours. A convoy of 340 civilian vessels, mostly agricultural transports, 2 medical ships, 14 colony infrastructure carriers, 1 mobile field hospital, 2 hours short of clear. I had sent 3 requests up the command chain for additional escort assets. I want this in the record. I sent 3. The first, 40 hours before the crossing, was acknowledged and logged. The second, 22 hours before, was acknowledged and referred to fleet logistics. The third, 8 hours before, received an automated acknowledgement and no further response. At the time of the crossing, the Ironfast was the only active naval vessel in the corridor or within 6 light towers of it. The other 2 escorts that had been assigned to RCG-7, the RNV Kroth and the RNV Solon Dar, had been redirected to the Undrath approach vector 4 days prior, when a second quorum wall was detected in that system. I do not record this as a grievance. Command decisions are made with incomplete information under impossible pressure, and I made enough of them in the following 41 hours to have no standing to throw stones at anyone who makes them from a position of better safety than I had. I record it because it establishes context. When I brought the Ironfast to the rearguard position at 3:47 on the day of the crossing, there was no decision being made. There was only a recognition of what was already true. Someone had to stand between the convoy and the wall. I had the only ship capable of it. There was nothing to decide. I told Commander Rahl to notify the crew. I told him to be honest with them, which he thought was a mistake, and said so, quietly and professionally, in the 18 seconds between my order and the ship-wide address. He believed it was better to frame the situation in terms of manageable tactical objectives rather than in terms of the full scope of what we were facing. He said, I remember this precisely, that a crew that understands it might not survive performs worse than a crew that believes it definitely will. I told him that my crew had earned the truth and that I trusted them with it. He gave the address. He was honest. He was also more careful with his words than I would have been, which is why I had given the job to him. What he told them, that the Ironfast was going to take up the rearguard position at the mouth of the Kareth corridor, that the convoy had a 2-hour deficit against the Quorum Wall's projected arrival, that our job was to close that deficit, to make the Quorum Wall's passage through the corridor cost enough time that the convoy cleared before the compression effect reached them, that it was going to be the hardest 40 hours of their lives, and that he expected them to perform to the standard they had always performed to, and that he had no doubt they would. What he did not say, because it did not need to be said, that the Ironfast was not going to follow the convoy out the far end of the corridor. The crew understood. They were, as I have said, my crew. They strapped in and they went to work. At 4:12, the Ironfast reached the rearguard position. The Quorum Wall was 36 hours out. The convoy was 22 minutes into its transit run, moving at maximum safe speed, all 340 vessels in tightly spaced formation columns. The Ironfast's position was directly between the wall and the convoy's trailing edge. The mobile field hospital, the vessel Grace, which was the slowest thing in the corridor and therefore the rearmost, and whose passengers included approximately 900 patients in various states of non-ambulatory medical care. I looked at the Quorum Wall on the main scope and tried to find something useful to think about it. What the scope showed was not easy to comprehend. The human visual system is not built for the scale of it. The feed from our long-range arrays was processed and compressed and displayed on a screen of finite dimensions, and still the mind struggled to build a model of what it was seeing. 14,000 hulls. The smallest of them, in the outermost edges of the wall's formation, were 40 kilometers long. The largest, in the center, were closer to 90. They moved in a formation so close that, from our position, the individual hulls were not individually visible. They resolved as a surface, as a wall in the literal architectural sense, as a cliff face of uneven dark material stretching 43,000 kilometers across. Behind them, barely visible, the compression wake, the distortion in local space-time that their combined mass and velocity generated. The space in front of them was not quite right, slightly warped, slightly off. The stars behind the wall, visible through the gaps between the outermost hulls at maximum magnification, were not quite in the positions they should have been. The mass was bending the light. It looked like the end of something. I thought about my crew. I thought about the 900 patients on the vessel Grace. I thought about the 14,000 hulls and the 2-hour deficit and the cold, specific arithmetic of the problem in front of me. Then I told Lieutenant Sen to give me everything she had on the wall's mass distribution and internal structural coherence. And I told Weapons Officer Tadich Mayer to bring the main battery online and give me a preliminary targeting spread. And I told Commander Rahl that we were going to need to be very creative and that I needed him thinking. He was already thinking. He had been since before I asked. Here is the thing about the Quorum Undying, that the tactical manuals, such as they were, 3 heavily caveated documents produced after the Undrath encounter, none of them authored by anyone who had survived an engagement, did not adequately capture. It could be inconvenienced. Not damaged, not stopped, not turned back, but inconvenienced, made to spend something, not energy, not lives, because the Quorum is not organized in any way that makes those concepts applicable, but something analogous to attention, to adjustment. When the Quorum's hulls encountered an obstacle that was persistent, that kept inserting itself into the calculation, the wall's movement pattern changed, not dramatically, subtly. Individual hulls at the edge of the affected area would shift their trajectories by fractions of a degree. Other hulls would shift to compensate. The overall vector of the wall would remain the same, but the local configuration would adjust. Each adjustment took time. Not much time. We are talking in each instance about adjustments measured in minutes, not hours. But minutes accumulated become hours, and hours were what we needed. What we had to work out, in the 6 hours before the engagement began in earnest, was how to maximize the number of adjustments the Quorum had to make while managing the Ironfast's own degrading combat capability across a 41-hour engagement window. Because every adjustment we induced cost something from us as well, and we were not going to be resupplied, not going to be reinforced, not going to have the option of falling back and regrouping. Rahl worked out the basic framework, Mayer refined the targeting, Sen ran the positional mathematics, I made the calls. The framework was this: do not engage the center of the wall. The center was where the largest hulls were, where the compression effect was strongest, where the Ironfast's weapons would have the least marginal effect per unit of energy expended. Instead, concentrate everything on the edges of the wall, the smaller hulls at the flanks, and work to force a progressive narrowing of the wall's effective width. If we could compress the wall's formation, reduce its spread from 43,000 kilometers to something closer to 39,000, we could create a passage margin for the convoy. We could make the narrowest point of the corridor wide enough. We could not do this by destroying the hulls. We did not have the firepower to destroy them. What we had was the ability to alter their surface temperature differentials at range. Our main battery, at sustained output, could heat the outer skin of a Quorum hull's leading face to the point where the hull's internal mass distribution logic, whatever governed the individual hull's movement at the molecular level, began to respond to the thermal gradient. It was not combat in any conventional sense. It was closer to geology. We were applying heat to a cliff face and watching the cliff adjust its angle of presentation, slowly, over hours, but measurably. By doing this to the outermost flank hulls, sustained, across multiple firing passes, we could induce them to draw inward, to rotate their leading faces away from the thermal gradient, and in doing so reduce the wall's overall width on that flank. The hulls behind them would then adjust to maintain formation cohesion, and those adjustments would propagate inward through the formation, each propagation taking time. Rahl was not certain this would work. He said so. He said he believed the logic was sound, but that there was no precedent, no data, no proof of concept, and that we were essentially running a real-time experiment with 340 civilian vessels and 900 medical patients as the dependent variable. I told him I understood that and that I had decided to proceed, and that I needed him to run it. He said yes. He always said yes in the end. He said yes the way a good officer says yes, having registered his reservation, having been heard, and then setting the reservation aside and doing the work. At 6:19, the Ironfast fired its first salvo. I am going to try to describe 41 hours of combat in a way that is honest without being an exhaustive tactical log, because the bridge recorder exists for the latter, and I am trying to write the former. What I want to convey is the texture of it, the accumulated weight of it across that stretch of time, which is a duration that most people have experienced in the context of a long voyage or a difficult work week, but which has a completely different quality when each hour of it is being spent at battle stations with a crew that is running on stimulants and necessity, and the specific kind of human stubbornness that looks, from the outside, like courage and feels, from the inside, like simple refusal. The first 6 hours were the cleanest. The Ironfast was fresh, the crew was sharp, the firing solutions were accurate, and the Quorum wall behaved approximately as Rahl had predicted. Our flank bombardment produced the expected adjustment response. The outermost hulls on the targeted flank began, slowly, incrementally, to draw inward. Not dramatically, not at a rate that would have been visible to a casual observer. But Sen was tracking it in real time, and her numbers were moving in the right direction. And after 4 hours of sustained fire, she looked up from her console and told me that the wall's effective width had reduced by approximately 300 kilometers on the targeted flank. 300 kilometers, against an initial width of 43,000, less than 1%. Mayer asked without particular inflection how we were doing. I told him we were ahead of pace. He did not appear to find this reassuring or otherwise. He went back to his targeting console and continued working. There is a specific quality to Tadich Mayer at a weapons console that I find difficult to describe to someone who has not seen it. He is not dramatic. He does not narrate his own actions, does not announce firing solutions with any particular emphasis, does not react visibly when a targeting sequence succeeds or fails. He simply works with the focused, incremental precision of a craftsman who has practiced the same motion 10,000 times and has arrived at a place beyond conscious thought. I have seen him run a 12-tube battery for 14 hours without a break and produce targeting data that a fresh crew of 3 would have been proud of. He does not think of himself as talented. I once told him directly that he was the finest weapons officer I had ever served with, and he told me that was a function of the battery's calibration and the quality of the targeting arrays, and that I should thank Chief Engineer Pont. He was not being falsely modest. He genuinely believed it. He was wrong, but I did not say so again. Some things are better left to a person's own understanding. What I will say is that the first 6 hours of the engagement produced something I did not expect and did not have a category for. A kind of quiet. Not silence. The battery was firing on a 16-second cycle, and the sound of it moved through the ship's frame with the regularity of a very large mechanical heart. But a quiet in the sense that the crew had arrived, in those first hours, at a collective calm that I had seen before only in crews much older and much further into their service than this one. They had been told what was happening. They had understood it. And having understood it, they had set it aside in the specific compartment that experienced naval personnel learn to maintain, the one that holds the things you cannot change and do not need to hold in the foreground to do your job. The Quorum wall was advancing. The convoy was moving. The Ironfast was firing. These were the only facts that required continuous attention, and the crew was attending to them with the focused precision of people who had decided, each in their own way, that this was the work, and the work was what mattered. At hour 9, the Quorum wall responded in a way we had not anticipated. 3 hulls at the far edge of the targeted flank, not the ones we were concentrating fire on, but 3 hulls approximately 800 kilometers behind the lead formation, altered their trajectories and began to move laterally. They were not moving to close the gap we were creating. They were moving outward. They were widening on the opposite flank. The wall was redistributing its spread. We were compressing one edge. It was expanding the other. Raw looked at me. I looked at the plot. The convoy on our tracking displays was a long, thin column of blue icons moving steadily along the corridor, 340 of them, spaced out across 22,000 kilometers of corridor length, the vessel Grace trailing at the back, her transponder signal clean and steady. Clean and steady. I remember looking at that transponder signal in the moments between the tactical problems and thinking about what it represented. 900 people who did not know what was happening behind them, who were in the hands of their nurses and their doctors, and the 3 crew members who ran the Grace's propulsion system, who were as far outside the mathematics of what the Ironfast was doing as it is possible to be, while still being the direct purpose of it. I told Mare to split the battery, half on the original flank sustained, half on the 3 redistributing hulls, stop the lateral movement first, then resume compression. He told me that splitting the battery would reduce the compression effect on the original flank by 47% and would likely cause the wall to re-expand in the area we had already cleared. I told him I knew that and to do it anyway. He did. We spent 6 hours fighting the redistribution before we managed to stabilize it. 6 hours during which our compression gains partially eroded. When Sen gave me the updated numbers at hour 15, the net effective width reduction was 220 kilometers, 60 less than we had achieved at hour 9 before the redistribution response. I went over the numbers with Rawl. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he told me that the redistribution response was information, that the Quorum had, in responding to our lateral flank work, demonstrated that it was paying attention, that whatever process governed the movement of its hulls was not fixed, not deterministic in the simple mechanical sense. It was adaptive. It was responding to us. He said that this was the first time, to his knowledge, that the Quorum Undying had demonstrably adapted its movement pattern in response to an obstacle. I told him that was interesting and asked him what it meant for our timeline. He said he needed 4 hours to model it. I told him he had 2. He produced a revised model in 90 minutes, which was raw in a sentence. The model said, the redistribution response would become more aggressive as the engagement continued, and the Quorum's local adjustment processes accumulated more data about our patterns. We needed to vary our targeting approach more radically and more frequently to prevent the wall from developing a counter-pattern. This would cost us efficiency. Every time we shifted approach, we would lose some of the progress the previous approach had built. But the alternative was to maintain a fixed pattern and watch the wall learn to compensate for it entirely. The model also said, at current rate, accounting for the redistribution response, we would achieve the required passage margin for the convoy with approximately 43 minutes to spare. 43 minutes. 41 hours and 43 minutes of total engagement time to produce a margin of 43 minutes at the end. I asked Rawl if he had confidence in the model. He said he had confidence in the mathematics and no confidence in any assumption about how the Quorum would behave beyond what it had already demonstrated, and that those two things together produced an estimate he was willing to stand behind while acknowledging it could be wrong in either direction. I said that was honest and that I was going to proceed on that basis. He said that he understood. We had at hour 15 been at battle stations for 15 hours. The stimulant protocol was in effect fleet-wide. The crew was managing. Rawl was managing. I was managing, by which I mean I was functioning at what I estimated to be 80% of my normal cognitive capacity, and what I was increasingly certain was closer to 65. The human brain under sustained high-stress conditions degrades in ways that are difficult to self-assess from the inside. I have been in enough extended engagements to know this, and I have developed the habit, in such conditions, of running a specific set of internal checks every 2 hours, basic arithmetic, spatial reasoning, a short sequence of planning problems, and comparing the time it takes me to complete them against my baseline. By hour 15, I was running approximately 8 seconds slower on the arithmetic and 12 on the planning problems. I noted this in the log, which I was keeping intermittently throughout the engagement, and I told Raul and asked him to monitor me for decision-making errors. He said he would. He had already been doing it, he said, since hour 11. I told him that was good work and that I was glad he was there. He said that he was there, that he intended to remain there, and that I should focus on the firing schedule. His version of sentiment, which I had come to find sufficient. Hour 20 brought the first structural casualty. Our weapons deck, Section 3, the forward port battery cluster, lost 2 of its 6 tubes to an internal pressure failure. Not enemy action. The Quorum does not fire weapons. The failure was thermal. Sustained high-tempo firing had pushed the cooling system in that section beyond its rated tolerance, and a junction seal had failed. Mayor had flagged the temperature climb 6 hours earlier, and we had implemented partial fire reduction in that section to manage it, but the partial reduction had not been enough, and the seal had failed anyway. I spoke to Chief Engineer Calipont. She told me the junction could be replaced, but that it would take the affected tubes offline for 3 hours minimum, and that if we tried to bring them back up before the cooling system had fully stabilized, we risked a larger failure that could cascade to the adjacent section. 3 hours offline for 2 of my 12 primary battery tubes. I told her to do the replacement safely, no shortcuts, and to keep me updated. She said yes ma'am and went away. Calipont has been the Ironfast's chief engineer for 4 years. She is 41 years old and she has, in those 4 years, replaced 3 drive components that the manufacturer's specifications indicated could not be replaced at speed without a full dry dock facility, and she accomplished each replacement with what she described as adequate tooling and a sufficiently motivated team. She does not accept the premise that things cannot be done. She accepts the premise that some things require more creativity than others, and that creativity is her professional domain. I trusted her completely, and I showed it by not following up and not checking in and not asking Raul to check in for me. When Calipont says she will do something, the appropriate response is to go back to what you were doing. Mayor redistributed the firing load across the remaining tubes and adjusted the targeting schedule. He did it without being asked, and his solution was, as far as I could evaluate it, correct. I approved it. The convoy on our displays continued its slow blue march through the corridor. Sen was tracking their progress in real time and updating me every 30 minutes with their position relative to the far terminus. At hour 20, the convoy's leading elements were 63% of the way through. 63%. The trailing elements, anchored by the vessel Grace, were 49%. The wall was 37% of the way to us. The math still worked, barely, but it worked. Hour 24 was the one that I think about most, in the moment since that permit thinking. Not because anything dramatic occurred. There was no single dramatic moment in those 41 hours, which is itself something worth saying, because the popular understanding of combat tends toward drama, toward moments of crisis that resolve into clarity, and this was not that. This was sustained, unrelenting pressure, applied incrementally over time. And hour 24 was simply the hour in which the accumulation of that pressure became most visible on the faces of my crew. I walked the bridge. I made a practice of walking the bridge every 2 hours, moving between stations, checking in personally rather than through the intercom. It is a habit I developed early in my command career, and one I maintained because I believe the physical presence of the commanding officer, during extended high-stress operations, has a measurable effect on crew function that no amount of intercom communication replicates. Hour 24, I walked the bridge. Lieutenant Sen was running on stimulants and what appeared to be a very specific kind of mathematical anger. She had her plot screen set to a display configuration I had never seen before, and she was annotating it in real time with trajectory projections that filled most of the screen with lines. And when I came to her station, she looked up at me with the expression of someone who has made peace with a situation and is now focused entirely on executing within it. She was 29 years old. She had been assigned to the Ironfast fresh from navigation school 18 months ago and had, in my estimation, exceeded every expectation I had formed of her in the first 3 months of that assignment. She had a quality that navigation school does not teach and cannot teach, which is the ability to hold a complex moving model in her mind with total fidelity, while simultaneously processing new data against it. The plot on her screen was a representation of what was already fully rendered inside her head. She maintained it there the way a musician maintains a score, not by referring to it but by inhabiting it. Weapons Officer Mayer was eating a ration pack at his station, chewing with the methodical deliberateness of a man who has decided that his body requires fuel and that this is a logistical problem to be managed. He looked at me when I came to his station, confirmed that the battery was performing to schedule, and returned to his ration pack. Rawl was standing at the strategic plot, as he had been for the better part of 20 hours. I had ordered him to sit on 4 separate occasions. He had, on each occasion, sat briefly and then stood again. He was 49 years old and had been a naval officer for 26 years, and I do not think he knew how to sit down when a ship he was on was in an engagement. There is a kind of officer who is constitutionally unsuited to passivity, who has organized his entire professional existence around the premise that the correct response to a difficult situation is to apply more direct attention to it, and for whom sitting in a chair while the situation continues represents a kind of self-betrayal that he is incapable of sustaining for more than a few minutes at a time. Rawl was that kind of officer. I understood it. I did not order him to sit again. I asked him how he was doing. He said he was fine and that the model's prediction was holding within tolerance, and that the convoy's transit rate had increased slightly in the past 2 hours, which he believed was due to the convoy commander having pushed the speed of the middle formation columns after receiving our updated margin estimate. I said that was good. He said that it was adequate, that he preferred a larger buffer, and that he was working on a secondary targeting approach that might improve the margin by an additional 20 minutes if the quorum's redistribution response continued to follow the pattern the model predicted. I told him to run it. He said he already was. Hour 28, Section 3 came back online. Calipont's team had replaced the junction and stabilized the cooling loop in 3 hours and 11 minutes, 11 minutes over the minimum estimate but well within the operational parameters we needed. I sent a message to the engineering section that said, in its entirety, "Well done." Pont sent one back that said, "We know." I love engineers. I have always loved engineers. They have a relationship with the actual material reality of the world that command officers spend most of their careers trying to approximate and rarely achieve. A command officer's tools are information and decision. An engineer's tools are the physical laws of the universe and the ingenuity to find the path those laws permit. The universe, it turns out, permits quite a lot, if you know where to look and are not too fastidious about the tools you bring to the looking. The quorum's redistribution response had continued to evolve. By hour 28, it had developed what Rawl described as a countercycle, a pattern in which the wall would absorb our targeting shift, and then, approximately 4 hours later, implement a redistribution response calibrated to that shift's parameters. It was not intelligence in any human sense. Rawl was careful to say this. It was adaptation, The same kind of adaptation that a body of water demonstrates when you push against it, the pushback shaped by the properties of the obstacle. But the adaptation was becoming faster. The countercycle that had taken 6 hours to develop at hour 9 was developing in 4 hours by hour 28. We began varying our targeting approach every 3 hours instead of every 4, trying to stay ahead of the countercycle's development. This further reduced our efficiency. We were now spending more transition time between targeting patterns and less time pressing any single pattern to its productive limit. Sen updated the margin estimate. 31 minutes. Down from 43, still positive, still enough. I asked Raul about his secondary targeting approach. He said it was promising, but required a firing pattern that would put the main battery at sustained output levels we had not previously attempted for periods longer than 40 minutes. He said the risk was another thermal failure, potentially a larger one than Section 3, potentially affecting 2 or 3 sections simultaneously. I asked him how much the secondary pattern improved the margin. He said 19 minutes best case. I told him that we did not need 19 more minutes, that we had 31, and that I was not willing to risk a major battery failure for margin we didn't need and wouldn't survive long enough to use. He said that he agreed with that assessment and that he had included the secondary pattern in the brief because I had asked him to run it, and because it was his job to provide me with options, not to filter them. I told him that was correct and appreciated. He said he knew. I am going to skip forward now, not because the hours between 28 and 38 were uneventful, they were not, but because to describe them individually would be to repeat myself in ways that I do not think serve the record. The texture of those hours was the same. Fire, adjust, adapt, redistribute, track, calculate, fire again. The crew performed. The wall advanced. The convoy progressed. The margin fluctuated. It reached a high of 38 minutes at hour 31, when we had a particularly successful targeting sequence, and a low of 22 minutes at hour 36, when the Quorum's countercycle accelerated, and we spent 4 hours in tactical disadvantage before Raul's model produced a new targeting approach that recovered the lost ground. What I will say about those hours is this. The crew of the Ironfast conducted themselves in a manner that I do not have adequate language for. I have the word professional, which is correct but insufficient. I have the word brave, which is accurate but misses the texture of it, because what they demonstrated was not the sharp, reactive courage of a sudden crisis, but the slow, grinding, accumulative courage of people who understood exactly what was happening and continued to do their jobs anyway. Hour after hour, firing solution after firing solution, engineering repair after engineering repair, mathematical calculation after mathematical calculation. They did not need speeches. They did not need reassurance. They needed, as far as I could tell, only to be allowed to work, and I allowed them to work, and they did. There is a quality in a well-run crew that is very difficult to describe and very easy to recognize, and it is this. They do not perform their jobs in the hope of being noticed doing them. They perform their jobs because the job is the thing that matters and the doing of it is sufficient. I have served with crews that were technically competent and motivationally fragile crews that needed constant affirmation to maintain their function, for whom the absence of recognition was itself a kind of damage. The Ironfast's crew was not that. They had, over 6 years of service together, arrived at a collective understanding that the work was the reward, that doing the work well was the only acknowledgement any of them needed from any of the others. I had contributed to that culture, I believe, but I had not created it. It had grown in the spaces between people who were good at their jobs and respected other people who were good at their jobs and had the humility to know the difference between contribution and performance. At hour 38, the convoy's leading elements were 91% through the corridor. The vessel Grace was at 82%. At hour 38, the Quorum wall was 11,000 kilometers from the Ironfast. 11,000 kilometers against hulls that are 90 kilometers in their primary dimension, against a formation that extends 43,000 kilometers across. The compression effect at that range was beginning to affect the Ironfast structurally, not dramatically, not catastrophically, but measurably. Pont reported microstress fractures appearing in the aft hull plating, the kind of fractures that would normally warrant an immediate withdrawal to space dock for structural inspection. She reported them to me as information, not as a recommendation, because Pont understood the situation completely and was not going to insult either of us by recommending something we both knew was not an option. I acknowledged the report and asked her what we needed to monitor. She told me. We monitored it. At hour 39, Rahl told me the convoy was going to clear. He said it with a precision that I recognized. He had run the numbers multiple times and arrived at the same answer each time, which was the threshold at which Rahl allowed himself to commit to a conclusion rather than a probability estimate. He said, "The convoy will clear. The vessel Grace will exit the far terminus of the corridor with 27 minutes to spare before the compression effect reaches her position." I asked about the margin erosion risk, whether there was any remaining scenario in which the Quorum's behavior could produce a different outcome. He said there was not. He said the wall's approach was now so advanced that its movement pattern was locked. There was insufficient distance remaining for any redistribution response to affect the convoy's exit timing. The physics of the situation had resolved. The convoy was going to make it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told him to inform the convoy commander. I told him to send it in plain text, not coded, because I wanted the 900 patients on the vessel Grace and the crew of every transport in that convoy to know, if they were watching their communication boards, that they were going to be all right. Rahl sent the message. The convoy commander, a civilian logistics officer named Pret Hassan, whom I had met once at a pre-transit briefing and found to be a competent and unsentimental woman, sent back a reply that said, "Understood. Thank you." Then, a separate message, 30 seconds later, containing only, "I'm sorry." I told Rahl to acknowledge it with one word, clear. She would know what it meant. The last 2 hours were different in quality from the 39 that preceded them. Not easier. The compression effect was increasing rapidly as the wall closed the final distance, and the structural stress on the Ironfast was becoming something I could feel rather than merely read on a display. The aft section was groaning in the specific low-frequency register that old ships make when their frames are being worked beyond their design parameters. The sound traveled through the deck plating and up through the soles of my boots, and it was not a comfortable sound, but it was a familiar one. The Ironfast had made that sound before in other engagements under other pressures. She had, each time, continued to function. I chose to trust that record. Pont had moved her team to the critical structural junctions. The main battery was performing. Mare kept it performing, through sheer bloody-minded expertise, through the kind of deep technical knowledge that looks effortless from the outside because it is being executed so cleanly. But the firing tempo had to be reduced as the compression distortion began to affect targeting precision at close range. The space between us and the wall was not behaving quite as physics required. The mass effect was bending light, bending sensor returns, bending the reliable geometry that a targeting solution depends on. We were still firing, we were still counting. The compression adjustments we induced in those final 2 hours were smaller, less significant to the overall engagement outcome, but I kept ordering them because the Ironfast was there, and the battery was operational, and stopping felt like a thing I did not know how to do. Rahl came to stand beside me at hour 40. He did not say anything for several minutes. I did not require him to. We looked at the plot together, the wall, filling the scope now, the individual hulls no longer resolving as a surface, but beginning to differentiate as we came close enough for our arrays to pick out detail. The nearest hull's surface is visible as dark, irregular material, not polished, not uniform, ancient in the specific way that things which have been in motion for 400,000 years accumulate the record of their passage. There were marks on the nearest hull faces that were not our damage. We had not reached them, not truly, not in any way that left a permanent record. The marks were older, impact scoring from objects encountered over centuries, thermal staining from passage through stellar nurseries. The accumulated geography of 400,000 years of uninterrupted motion through a galaxy that had mostly gotten out of the way. He said, "The vessel Grace has exited the corridor." I said, "Good." He said, "All 340 vessels are confirmed clear." I said, "Good." He said, "The compression effect will reach the Ironfast's aft section in approximately 4 minutes." I said, "I know." He stood beside me. After a moment, he said, "And I want this in the record because I think it matters," that he had filed his formal objection to the mission assignment in the first hour of the engagement, and that he wished to withdraw it now. I asked him why. He said because it had turned out to be exactly the right thing to do, and he did not want there to be a formal objection in the record that suggested otherwise. I told him that a formal objection filed in good faith on the basis of the information available at the time was exactly the kind of record I wanted to exist, and that I would not accept its withdrawal. He said, "That's a command decision." I said, "It is." He said, "Understood, Captain." Then he told the crew over the ship wide that all convoy vessels were confirmed clear, that the Ironfast had done what it came to do, that he was proud to serve with every one of them, and that he wanted that in the record too. The bridge went quiet in the way that places go quiet when something is ending, and everyone in them knows it. I thought about the Quorum Undying. 14,000 hulls, 400,000 years in motion, the oldest moving thing in the known galaxy. It had never altered course, not once in recorded history. 3 prior contact events had produced 3 prior instances of xenographic study, and in all 3 the conclusion was the same. The quorum does not deviate. The quorum does not adjust. The quorum moves, and what is in its path ends, and it continues. I thought about what we had made it do for 41 hours. I thought about the adjustment responses, the counter cycles, the redistribution patterns that had developed in response to our targeting, patterns that had not been predicted by any model, that had not been observed in any prior contact event, that existed because the Ironfast had been there, in the wall's path, being persistently, deliberately, specifically inconvenient in ways the quorum had apparently never encountered before. The quorum, in 400,000 years of motion, had never had anything push back. Not because nothing had tried. Other things had certainly been in its path. Other civilizations in those vast uncatalogued centuries had certainly placed themselves between it and wherever it was going. But whatever they had done had not been enough to produce an adaptive response. Whatever they had done had not been strange enough, specific enough, sustained enough. Whatever they had done had not lasted long enough to make the quorum learn the shape of it. Whatever they had placed between themselves and the wall had been moved, and the quorum had continued, and the moving had not registered as anything that required a new kind of attention. The Ironfast had lasted long enough. I want to be precise about what I am not claiming. I am not claiming that the quorum understood what we were doing in any sense that maps to understanding as human beings experience it. I am not claiming that what followed was vengeance, or recognition, or any response that has an emotional valence. I am describing something that I observed, and that Sen documented, and that will be in the sensor logs for whatever review body examines them. In the 90 seconds before the compression effect reached the Ironfast's hull, the quorum wall changed course. Not dramatically, not by a margin that would have saved us. The compression effect at that range was physics, not something a course change could undo at that distance and velocity, but the wall's overall vector shifted by 0.003 degrees. The center of the wall, the largest hulls, the ones we had never been able to touch, the ones that had been moving in the same direction for longer than our civilization has existed, moved, fractionally, in a direction that was not the direction they had been moving in for 41 hours, and not the direction they had been moving in, presumably, for considerably longer than that. Sen said quietly, "Captain, the wall is adjusting course." I said, "I see it." She said, "That's not in the literature, they don't." I said, "I know." She looked at me. I said, "Log it. Get everything you have into the black box. Full sensor capture from the last 90 seconds. Make sure it's in there." She said, "Yes, ma'am." She was still entering commands when the compression effect reached us. The structural cascade was rapid. Pont's team had isolated the critical sections. The casualties were contained. The bridge held. The recording held. The black box, which is designed to survive conditions that the ship it rides in cannot, held. This is the last entry in this document. I want to say one more thing for whoever reads this. Not about tactics, not about the engagement, about the math. The math said it could not be done. 2 hours of deficit against a wall that had never once adjusted its course, that had never once been made to pay attention, that was older than our species' memory, and larger than anything we had ever built, and was indifferent to all of it in the way that ancient things are indifferent. Not with malice, not with intention, simply without the capacity to register that what it was moving through had ever mattered. The math was incomplete. It did not account for the RNV Ironfast. It did not account for a weapons officer who kept a battery firing through thermal conditions that should have shut it down 3 times. It did not account for a navigation officer who ran positional mathematics for 41 hours and never once gave me a number I had reason to doubt. It did not account for an engineer who fixed what needed fixing in the time available and then kept fixing things I did not know needed fixing. It did not account for a crew that was told the truth and met it the way my crew always met everything. And it did not account for the thing I do not have an explanation for, that Sen recorded in the last 90 seconds, that will be in those logs waiting for whoever is skilled enough and patient enough to understand it. The oldest moving thing in the galaxy looked at one human warship that refused to stop being in its way. And for the first time in 400,000 years, it moved around us. I do not know what that means. I am not a xenographer. I am not a philosopher. I am a naval officer who has spent 6 years learning the character of one particular ship and the people who crew her, and in that capacity I will offer only this. The Quorum Undying moved through this galaxy for 400,000 years on the premise that nothing in it was worth adjusting course for. Whatever its processes are, whatever ancient calculus governs its motion through space, it had arrived at a stable conclusion about the nature of resistance. That resistance ended always, and the path continued always, and the moving was the only fact that persisted. The Ironfast changed that calculation, not by defeating the Quorum, not by stopping it, not by any outcome that a conventional tactical measure would rate as a victory, by being, for 41 hours, the specific kind of problem that 400,000 years of motion had not prepared the Quorum to simply absorb, by making the cost of the original heading, in whatever units the Quorum measures cost, marginally higher than the cost of the adjustment. Marginally, 0.003 of a degree. I find that I am satisfied with that. The convoy is clear, and the oldest moving thing in the galaxy knows now that something in this part of space does not simply get out of the way. That is information it will carry forward, in whatever form the Quorum carries information, into the 400,000 years that follow. The convoy is clear. That's enough. Captain Anise Varro, RNV Ironfast, end of personal log.